I was always exploring new environments.
I'll take you back to your childhood first.
They asked me, what did I want to be when I grow up? I said, a professor. I have no recollection of why I came up with that answer. It must have been something I read or saw on TV. I just thought it would be the neatest job to have. People sometimes assumed I was a secretary. It was challenging when I found out that another assistant professor, a male, who had been hired and started the same time I did, was earning a significant amount more than I did. The computer science department did not care about human beings whatsoever. I spent a lot of time changing the mindset, influencing the mindset of engineers who, again, were just looking at the technology.
Hello and welcome to Project Oneness World. Today we are in conversation with Professor Diane Sonnenwald. Still active in her research, Diane is Emerita Professor and Emerita Chair of Information and Communication Studies at the School of Information and Communication Studies at University College Dublin, Ireland, where she served as head of school. And she has been a distinguished visiting professor at National Taiwan Normal University and a Fulbright professor at the University of Tampere, Finland. So Diane is a stalwart of the information science field with over 130 peer-reviewed publications and more than 6,000 citations on Google Scholar. She conducts research on multidisciplinary collaboration, socio-technical design and evaluation, and information behavior. She has received over 25 grants from international foundations and funding agencies, including the National Science Foundation, National Institutes of Health, National Library of Medicine, and the European Science Foundation. She has served on the editorial boards of 6 international journals and served on multiple advisory boards, most recently that of a European Union citizen science project focusing on data privacy. And before joining academia, Diane worked at Bell Communications Research and Bell Laboratories, and she has a PhD from Rutgers University in New Jersey and is currently a consultant to the European Commission, the Chartered Institute of Library and Information Professionals, and other organizations. So Diane has a whole string of distinguished awards, so I'm just going to list out a few. And she received the Fellowship Award, the Award of Merit, and the Watson Davis Award from the Association for Information Science and Technology, or ASIS&T. And she also received the Muhlenberg College Distinguished Alumni Award, the U.S. Army Research Lab Scientific Contribution Award, the Bell Communications Research Award of Excellence, among many others. So at ASIS&T, she served as president in 2011 and 12. So Diane, when you were ASIS president, I vividly remember walking up to the stage to receive the James Kretzo's Leadership Award from you, and I had my daughter with me at that point. So from your leadership to your research, you've always been an inspiration to me in more ways than one, and I'm really delighted to be speaking with you today. So thank you, Diane, for being here. And to begin, can you tell us your story in your own words?
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to participate in your One Worldness series. It's a pleasure to be here. And yeah, as I was mentioning before we began, I'm always a bit surprised that people are interested in learning about my story, my career path. And so I'll share components of it today with you and the audience. And of course, interrupt and ask questions anytime. I'll start off with talking about my childhood. I was extremely fortunate in that the public school system where I grew up was a very good public school system. They cared about learning, they cared about the health of all of the students. And it really gave me the opportunity to explore different things, to learn, and to have fun while doing it. You know, I still remember fondly my third grade teacher, Miss Till, who had us doing arts and crafts when we were learning about Native American Indians, doing Native American Indian crafts in the class. You know, and this was back in the 1960s. I and at that time, I also had speech problems, and the school provided speech therapy lessons for me. You know, the bad news is a lot of these lessons were during research time, So I missed out on some of the research, but it certainly did help my speech. And I was amazed years later when I saw the movie The King's Speech. I recognized those exercises that they were giving the King of England in 1939. And here in the early 1960s, I, as a young girl, was receiving that same instruction. I think that's phenomenal.
It is, yeah, yeah.
Phenomenal that, it went from helping the King of England to helping me. And it shows how innovation diffusion is so, and adoption is so important.
And you want to
At
talk
the
about
time,
the town this was in and the name of the school?
this was Central School, has since been knocked down in Springfield, Delaware County, Pennsylvania.
Right.
And yeah, it was a small local elementary school. But and then I continued. I went to the junior high school and to the high school as well, and still go back for high school reunions. And we share our life experiences and memories with each other when we go back. I didn't begin in the LIS field during my career. After I graduated from college, Muhlenberg College in Pennsylvania, it was a tough time to find jobs. I remember reading one ad that said, a person with a college degree that's highly sensitive, willing to learn, to work in a pickle factory. That's a job requirement, to work on an assembly line in a pickle factory, just to give you an idea of how tough the job market was.
Right.
But there was one job market opening up, and that was programming. And at the time, it was very unusual. I think most universities, colleges did not offer degree programs in computer science. But I was able at Muhlenberg to take a few courses in programming, doing
Right.
Fortran programming. And I had a double major in math and in German with a minor in education. And so I was hired by Prudential Insurance to be a programmer. They were located in New Jersey, and they provided a 2.5, 3 month training program to teach you how to program using their tools and languages. At the time, the Prudential Insurance Company had the largest computing center outside of the government in the Northeast United States. And so there was lots of technology there to learn, to play with, to have fun with. I was in the electronic funds division, writing programs such as check reconciliation, electronic funds transfer programs. And after a while, if you're good at programming and you're in that New Jersey area, you get invited to work at Bell Laboratories. First, as I was there as a consultant, and along the way, got my master's degree in computer science at Montclair State University. So I was firmly set on the computer science track, and I went to Rutgers, starting a PhD program part-time while working full-time, initially at Bell Laboratories, and then with the breakup of AT&T, I switched to Bell Communications Research, which was the equivalent of Bell Labs, but focused on the regional phone companies at the time. So I did my coursework in computer science, the PhD coursework that's required in all the US doctoral programs. As you know, there's a certain number of courses and exams you have to take. I took all those courses, working full time, had my daughter at the time and my son. Actually, I had my daughter doing my master's degree and my son doing my doctorate degree. And I was really interested in the person connecting with the technology. Well, at that time, the computer science department at Rutgers did not care about human beings whatsoever. They said, Yeah, there's somebody studying human-computer interaction somewhere, but we're not concerned about that. We don't care about anything outside of the technology and the network. So it was very hard to come up with the dissertation proposal that I wanted to do and that faculty members wanted to support in that department. I was lucky enough in that I had one more course to take in databases, and I was able to do an independent study. And after one or two meetings with the professor said, well, what you're talking about is interesting, but nobody here on the faculty is interested in what you're talking about. But I know this other guy in this other department who would be interested in what you're talking about. So he said, I'll invite this other guy to join us. I said, okay, what's to lose? Well, that other guy turned out to be Nick Belkin. And I didn't know who Nick was at the time, of course. He was just this other guy who might be interested in what I was interested in. And after two or three meetings with the three of us, Nick said, Diane, you need to transfer over to my department. We'll finish up the independent study here, etc. And then you need to transfer next semester. You need to be in the School of Information and Communication Studies. And so that's what happened. I transferred over, and they were very gracious with respect to requirements at the School of Information and Communication Studies, and that they only required me to take a few courses. They accepted all my credits from computer science. When it came to qualifying exams, because I had already passed my qualifying exams in computer science, I had a reduced qualifying exam in information and library studies, which was great. And of course, Nick was my advisor. And, and I was still working full time at Bellcore, Bell Communications Research. And there I was quite lucky as well. At the time, so this was the late 70s, no, late 80s, early 90s. Everybody knew that the public switch telephone network in the US and around the world was going to change. At the same time, I was working at Bell Communications Research, also known as Bellcore. And this was the mid to late 80s. And we all knew the network technology was changing, but wasn't clear how it was going to change. I got involved in a project to develop the network architecture 50 years out. And I was taking the perspective of the human network interface. Right. And the original mindset was, in all the engineers' diagrams, they had a phone as the human network interface and as the human. I'm a visual person, and I added people there, faces and everything. I had spent a lot of time changing the mindset, influencing the mindset of engineers who, again, were just looking at the technology. I was very fortunate. I got the position as technical advisor to an assistant vice president in charge of this architecture effort. And one afternoon, he had planned a multi-party conference call with other assistant vice presidents in the regional phone companies. So there is going to be 4 people in this conversation. He wanted me there to ask questions, to provide information. The only problem was no one could get the multi-party call set up. And I just sat back, very quiet, let all of these men with PhD degrees work through this. The only way they finally figured out how to do that is my boss, an assistant vice president, years ago had programmed one of the switches used in the telephone network. And he remembered those programming primitives and applied that logic to the phone interface to get the multi-party call set up. Yeah, we had the conversation. And at the end, I said, people, do you think know those switch programming primitives? And he said, oh, he immediately understood what I was talking about, and that interface was insufficient. Um, and he said, how much money did you want for your project? And he was very supportive. I negotiated with him that I would work for him for a year, and then he would support my dissertation research for 2 years. And that was very fortunate. He was very generous with that. And not only did he support it financially, but he allowed me to have access and to various services at Belcour and facilities and people at Belcour. So that was terrific. That said, the time I worked for him, one of the reasons I wanted to switch from industry to academia is that when I worked in that position, we were doing long-term strategic planning. If I spent 2 nights a week with dinner with my family, that was a good week. Because many hours, and because we were also coordinating responses to the governments, to public authorities across the US, I had to work with my counterparts and other people out in Pacific. Pac Bell, which is located in California, there's three hours time difference from the East Coast US to the West Coast US. And so my counterpart, her boss would ask her to get data and information at 5 p.m. Well, that's 8 p.m. on the East Coast. And there we would be talking and working together through what was my evening. And in those days, we got very good at describing slides and graphics over the phone because there wasn't a Zoom. There weren't other tools to share graphics and computer screens online. But I certainly, later when I was developing the information horizons theory and method as a visual method, certainly doing all of these visual things supported that effort, that visual thinking approach. That's how I then came to work in academia, and there were challenges there. What else would you like me to talk about?
So maybe I'll take you back to your childhood first, I think, of home. Like if you think back to what's the first thing you ever remember from your life, what do you remember?
There was kindergarten, and I had a very loving kindergarten teacher. I was quite ill when I was in kindergarten, but I kept my homework assignment from the last day I was in kindergarten and brought it with me 2.5 months later when I came back. And Mrs. Tinsman was so amazed. But and that was sort of set up my lifelong habit of meeting deadlines and keeping papers well organized.
So you started that well in kindergarten.
Yeah. And I remember telling my parents, I was in first or second grade, when they asked me what did I want to be when I grow up. I said, a professor.
Wow.
I have no recollection of why I came up with that answer. There was no one in my family that was working in academia. It must have been something I read or saw on TV. I just thought it would be the neatest job to have.
No, I was just going to say that I think you were destined to be a professor, and you were thinking about it early on, at the back of your mind somewhere.
In second grade, I had a snake that my father found in the garden and brought it in for show and tell. And the snake got loose. They had to do a search for the snake through the school. That made it into the local newspaper. I guess that's my first press coverage. The snake got loose, like a classroom. It was not a poisonous snake. It was a simple gardener snake. I did like snakes.
You talked about your career and different stages of your career. That I was struck by a few things. You talked about being a programmer at Prudential, right? Your first job at the point, and I think your CV says 1976 to 1977 for when you were there. And so, what programming languages did you use?
Well, they used a version of COBOL called COBOL.
Okay,
They prudentialized it. Um, and, there were several reasons why they did that. One was to better support the type of applications that they needed to run the insurance business. And I think the other was to help retain employees because no one else used COBOL. They used COBOL, of course.
yeah.
Um, but yeah, when I started out, we were still using key punch machines and key punching cards and reading them in. That quickly changed. And when I did my master's degree, of course, then I learned assembler and picked up Fortran again, as well as COBOL, doing my master's in computer science.
And did you also have to use Pascal at some point?
Use
Uh,
Pascal.
yeah,
Really, I remember we may have had some seminars or class sessions about it, um, but not heavily. No.
okay. So one of the issues in computer science is the number or the role of women in the field, right? And there have not been even until recently not that many women in the field as compared uh, to men. And so, did you at that point, like, did you see a difference, or were you among the few women out there, or were there quite a few?
No, there was one female professor at um, Montclair, and there was one female professor at Rutgers. On the job at Prudential, it was fairly well balanced between male and female. Um, at Belcour, it was maybe 70-30. But then that would depend upon what area you were in. So at that period, Belcourt, they were having a lot of reorganizations. And I remember my boss was one of those, because we were doing strategic planning, he was moved around the company quite a bit.
Right.
And I would go with him. And one reorg, I had been working for him for a while. We were discussing the latest reorg. And I said, there's no other technical woman in your division, of 200 people. I was it. And he said, oh, no, Diane, I knew you were going to bring this up. And I made sure we had at least 4 women other than you in this division. And
Okay.
I said, Pat, look at the latest org chart. And he said, oh, no, the department heads had changed things around and the woman had been moved. He said, he was not pleased that they had done, because the last version he had seen included women and other version, but the final version did not.
Okay.
I left it to him to sort that out. And certainly in my position at Belcourt, it was, people sometimes assumed I was a secretary. The smart people, when they were informed that was not the case, apologized, and we moved on from there.
Okay.
Some people aren't so smart. So there was one department head chair who I needed to get certain information from for the strategic planning efforts. And in my role, everybody in the company had to talk to me. I mean, your career was over if you refused to talk to me, more or less. Not that I was so important, but the people I was reporting to were so important. And so this one person kept on not returning my calls. So I would go visit him and finally caught him in the office. And I said, I need information on such and such thing of the network. And he literally threw a bunch of printouts at me of slides. He threw them at me, caught them. I sat down and I started going through them. And I started asking questions because I knew I needed more information than what was on those slides. And he clearly did not want to answer these questions. I was between him and the door, and he wasn't going to go out. So I continue asking these questions, going into more and more detail. And finally, he looked up from his desk, finally looked me eye to eye, and said, "You're asking very important questions for being a secretary." And I didn't know who should be more insulted, the secretaries or me. And I said, "Well, that's because I'm not a secretary, as I have mentioned." You know, he said, "Oh," and he never apologized, but he did change his attitude.
No, I think it is the inherent prejudice which is there. I think you were an exception to what he expected, and that prejudice, in a way, lives on in different forms today as well in people. And you
Yes.
find instances of these in different places. Like my wife, she's a physician, so one of the things she says is that in the US, she's a doctor. In India, she's a lady doctor.
Uh,
So it's little things like that. If there is a man who is a junior doctor along with her, so a lot of times people would first go and ask the man before approaching her. But I hope things change and things are changing. So you talked about Bell Labs, and you were there that AT&T Bell Labs from 1980 to 1985, and then you joined Bell Communications Research. So looking at AT&T now and its continued role, and what do you see as has changed, or in terms of communications and the role of big organizations like AT&T when you look at it now from from having been a part of it?
well, I must say, I had not kept up with the field in the same way I was uh, familiar with it before. Um, we were doing long range strategic planning for 25 years and out. And what we predicted would happen did happen. Um, I don't feel qualified to comment on the telecom network and communications networks today. Um,
No, and
I mean, the internet. I was mentioning to a friend, years ago, I said, "This is the Wild West." This was back in 1980, late 80s, and the telephone companies loved that the FCC said, you know, "You're not going to be responsible for any of the content on there." But then nobody became responsible for the content on there. And we have misinformation, false information, um, all sorts of problems today. That was, the writing was sort of on the wall
right.
40 years ago that this was going to happen. This, you know, would happen. I don't know what the writing on the wall is today.
No, and it's interesting because I find your background fascinating because I have a computer science degree as well, and I came to the information field from there, having worked in the industry. And one of my jobs is also in the telecom area, and I was working on a server team. We were developing voice over IP solutions in the late 90s and like in the year around the year 2000 there. And at that time, I would explain it as you can make a phone call from one computer to the other computer, or have a phone call that originates from a computer or ends at a computer. And then very soon people got used to Skype, and this was before Skype. And so then later on, of course, now people are used to then go to meeting and Zoom and all of that. But it's interesting. I think it's so when you were talking about your early jobs there and all that. So I was kind of seeing myself a little bit in what you were describing, but of course, like years later. And so going back to the part where you're talking about academia, right? So what have been some of the most significant steps and turning points in your career? And you talked about the part leading from the industry years, and we can talk about the academia part now.
Yeah. Um, well, two things happened. Well, a lot of things happened at UNC, but two very positive things is I was interviewing a professor in chemistry about collaboration. He was recommended to me by a professor in biology, and because he had set up this chemistry professor to collaborate with people in industry. And so I interviewed the professor, and as we do when we ask for an interview, we explain why we're doing the interview. And on the consent form, we explain what the interview is focusing on, why we're doing the content, the duration, etc. And when I met him, I've introduced myself and again explained what the interview was about and why, what I was studying and why I felt this was important. Well, he gracefully set up an interview time for me, and we were talking, and I was asking him questions about his experiences collaborating. And about 15 minutes into the interview, he said, "You're asking very good questions. Why are you asking these questions?" And I explained again why I was asking these questions. And he said, "We need you." I said, "What?" What do you mean? He was putting together a research center, and they had the first proposal was rejected, and he was going to put together the next version to resubmit these ideas. And he said, one of our problems is we don't know how to collaborate. These were physical chemists, polymer chemists, theoretical chemists, chemical engineers across 5 different universities. And he said, most of us don't know how to collaborate. Can you work with us so we can collaborate? Well, that started a multi-year collaboration with him. Joe DeSimone, who has won a very prestigious award in chemistry. The university was hoping he would become a Nobel Prize winner in chemistry at some point. I worked with him. I didn't hear from him for a couple of months, but then when it came time to finalize their proposal, he contacted me and said, what can you do? What can you add here? And so I wrote a couple of pages for them to include in the proposal. And this was for a National Science Foundation Science and Technology Center, which was the largest program the NSF was funding at the time, the largest in terms of the grant money given to universities.
Right.
And one of the steps at that point, after your proposal made it through various levels of review, NSF would bring people on site, and you had 2 days to present the center to them to answer questions. We practiced for days doing this. The University Research Office was very much involved because this was big bucks to them as well. And so I participated in that. I gave my presentation. There were no LIS, information science people on the review panel that was there. They were chemical engineers, theoretical chemists, and people working for NSF, National Science Foundation. So the result of that review was the panel said they would fund the center if the center was willing to make 3 changes. One of those changes was providing more funding for my work.
That's wonderful.
Yeah. They said, you won't succeed if you don't collaborate, and you need Diane's work to learn how to collaborate and start collaborating. So that was very much action research. And the bad news there was every 6 months, either the board would review the center or NSF would review the center. And because my work was so different from, clearly I'm not researching polymers or, chemical models and series, and everybody found it so interesting. Every 6 months, I and my team had to present new results. It's very hard to present new results every 6 months,
Right. Yeah.
where, the other, 70 scientists, you know, they could rotate that responsibility among themselves. But there was me and then one other social scientist who joined me and our students. And but it certainly was a wonderful learning experience. I learned a lot about research management. They were really nice people that I was able to work with there in chemistry. And and the other great thing that happened there was a computer science PhD student who somehow took a course in information science in our department, or heard me talk. She wasn't in one of my classes, but somehow she heard me talk and learned about my work and came and met with me. And she said, they need you over here in this computer science project called the nanomanipulator. And I said, okay. So she set up a meeting between myself, she was there as well, and one of the lead PIs on the nanomanipulator project. Well, that also developed into a multi-year project funded by the National Institutes of Health. And what my role in it was to develop a collaborative version of a standalone tool called the nanomanipulator that provided haptic and 3D visualization feedback to an atomic force microscope. And that eventually became a product. And I did get some royalties for a while until that company that had it as a product was purchased by a competitor, and the competitor said, we're not interested. We purchased you, so we don't have to compete with you. Goodbye. Okay. So that was my first long-term collaboration with the computer science department. And from there, I had another long-term collaboration with the computer science department looking at 3D telepresence technology in emergency healthcare.
So there was a lot of these things happening serendipitously in some ways, right? It's happening by chance that you just happened to be in those places and things fell into place.
Right. And, but then it happened, it may have started a bit by chance, but I know in the questions you sent me earlier, you said, what are the key skills you have developed over the years? And one of those is listening, I think. So I was able to listen to people when they were talking about their work and their challenges and ask questions and share insights in that. A lot of people, when they start collaborating, they just want to tell what they know. They don't want to listen to other people talking about what they need to know, what they do know and what they don't know, and where their challenges are. And so in these situations, I'd listen to what people were saying and developed a solution with them. So with the nanomanipulator, they were saying, well, we have problems with this interface and that feature, and understanding how this feature connects to that feature and how to go from all these different features and how to schedule these things, these various experiments. And I'd listen to that, ask some probing questions about that, and said, well, we could do A, B, and C. What do you think? Right. But it starts with listening, and listening deeply, intensely, to understand what the other person is saying and the meaning behind what they're saying. And then looking at possibilities, seeing possibilities.
And it's interesting that you talk about listening as a key skill. because I think in this world right now, and I've spoken about this with many people. In one of the interviews I watched, the person was talking about how when someone is talking, we're not really listening. We are thinking about what to say next in our mind, or like how can I answer? Or sometimes like your mind is so you're rehearsing something in your mind rather than leaving that aside and simply listening. And there's this person called Thich Nhat Hanh who talks about the concept of compassionate listening, where
Uh,
where he says that you listen with compassion, not as a way to provide a solution to someone, but really just to understand or just to be a person who is simply there and you're bringing a presence there over there in the conversation and to listen. So I think it is very interesting that you bring that out as and especially when I look at your life and career and I think would you say that listening has had a key impact in the growth you've had over the years as a skill that helped you achieve all of these things?
yeah, it definitely has.
Yes, I think so. So this is something is I think a takeaway for anybody who's watching this is to develop more of that listening ability. I think, and in a way it is something that you don't need much to do. You just need to bring yourself there with your full attention. And for other activities, you might need to do more, but listening is simple in that sense, but also difficult.
Yeah,
And
yeah. And of course, when we do research, then it's also um, seeing connections between things.
right,
Who was it? Was it Process said, it, research or innovation is seeing, uh, not discovering new lands, but seeing new relationships between things. And so when doing that intensive listening and then seeing the relationships and between what other people might see as disparate things.
and I have a feeling that this ability to see connections between things perhaps happens when you move from one very different field to another very different field, or you move from one location to the other. And so, just the fact that you are there from one environment to the other, but then you're able to make some connections. But if you were to spend most of our times in one kind of an environment or one kind of a job, then maybe those connections are harder to build. But when you, like in your case, I see you move from industry to research and then deeper into academia. And then also, I think what my next question was going to be about your move from the US, right? From University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and then from there you moved to Sweden.
Right.
So as you move geographies or even continents, right? In which case,
Yeah.
I think you are bringing about with you that ability to see differences and then to find commonalities in some ways.
Mm. Oh, yes, thank you. Yeah, seeing those commonalities and relationships is so important.
Yes, so you want to talk about your move from the US to Europe and the
Uh,
and different countries in Europe as well, and then to Asia.
so, so it really probably has its roots back in high school, where I was an exchange student to West Berlin.
Okay.
My high school had an exchange program, both with a school outside of Paris and a school in West Berlin. And it was West Berlin at the time. Um, well, I wasn't taking French, but I was taking German. So I applied and was accepted uh, to do that. So I spent a year between ages of 15 and 16 in West Berlin. And that certainly introduced me to a very different culture and different lifestyles.
Right.
So, here I was, a naive, say probably very naive, 15-year-old. Unfortunately, they put me in with students who were 2 years older than me and were living in a city where I was living in a suburb, very quiet. There was one bar in town, and only the bad people went to the bar. Yes, and here these students they went to the bar after class. Yeah, so quite quite a difference. And of course, they weren't bad people or bad students. They were just 2 years older than me and had different perspectives. And they were nice. I began. So their school year was very different in terms of timing than in the US school year. And, it was January, beginning of February, their school year changed, and everybody was going on to get a higher grade. And I basically stopped going to classes, but went around to the various museums and different institutions. There was the Goethe Institution. I had a friend who worked as an usher in the concert hall, and she would get discount tickets or free tickets and share them with me. So it was just a wonderful experience for a young person to have that type of freedom and be able to do these different things. Go to plays, go to museums, go to concerts, explore different park areas, hear different people's stories about what had happened to them during their lives. And so that was my first experience living outside the US. And I repeated that as an undergraduate student, spent a semester in Heidelberg, and had a wonderful roommate there, and just had a great experience. Then after completing my PhD, I applied to NSF and NATO for postdocs, and I was awarded two. And I spent those, originally the plan was to spend one in Denmark and one in Germany. But I ended up spending both in Denmark at RISO, which was the Danish National Research Lab at the time, outside of Copenhagen. And as a assistant professor, I was invited to apply to be a Fulbright scholar at the University of Tampere. Mirja Ivanovin was there, and she and I had met at a conference and had begun collaborating. So she supported that and invited me to apply. And that's where I first got to know about the Swedish School of Information and Library Science when I was in Tampere. So I was always exploring new environments since I was 15 years old. So it didn't seem so odd to me that then I would move from North Carolina to Sweden. And I was very fortunate that my husband supported that. He supported the postdocs in Denmark, the move from New Jersey to North Carolina, and then the move from North Carolina to Sweden.
Right.
And we towed the kids along with us.
And it must have been hard for them as well, like adjusting uh, to different countries and leaving the
Um,
kids behind in some ways.
yeah, and I felt a bit about that at one point, but then I talked to other people, other parents who had done this, and they said, don't worry about it. The kids will come to appreciate it. And they have.
Oh, that's wonderful. Yeah. And I was also thinking about that part when you talked about your initial exchange visit and where you were of this view that bad people go to bars, and then you see this your classmates or people who are like good, and
Yeah.
they were going to bars. So how did that change your perception about the goodness of doing things, or the like what is good or bad in terms
Yeah.
of activity versus per people?
I've never met anybody who went to a bar before I moved to Germany. But the culture in my parents' house, in the church, it wasn't overly emphasized, but it was sort of, you know, you knew the feeling about that bar was that's not a good place to go.
Right.
You know, um, I never met anybody. I'd never gone into that bar. I never met anybody who had gone into that bar that I knew of. I mean, I probably had, but I didn't
Right.
know. It's not the first thing you ask somebody when you're here talking with them, or even the second or third thing. Um, but then in West Berlin, I mean, the other students invited me to go with them. They say, we go to the bar, and they had beer, afterwards, at the bar. And it's not that they, had lots of beer, but they would have a beer. And, I said, oh, this is different. And I said, okay, so there are different perspectives, different approaches, and that's okay. And yeah.
No, and I think that is a growth opportunity in some ways because sometimes we are self-righteous in our thinking, and then we meet
Mm,
other people looking at things differently, and then that helps us see things that no, it's okay to be whatever things thought of as good or bad doesn't necessarily define people as good or bad,
yeah.
right? And I think and that was interesting to me when you talked about it because I think it's an interesting insight. So you talked about your childhood and your career going from Bell Labs, then going to academia and moving countries. So when we talk about let's say the information science field now that has been a big part of your research. So maybe you can talk about the field and your own role within it, especially about the information horizons theory as well, which is used by so many researchers in their research.
Well, that is very much on my mind these days because I'm actually finally putting together a book on information horizons.
Wonderful.
And Jenna Hartel is working with me on the book. We have authors who have contributed chapters talking about how they used information horizons, the method and the theory. And in these chapters, people are going beyond what we usually say in a journal paper or a conference paper, where they're telling a personal story about using the theory and method. Uh, Jenna is writing chapters talking about how she's used it in teaching. At this point, over 800 students have used it in their projects in her information behavior course. And we have other people writing about how they've used it in their undergraduate and graduate student teaching as well. The first chapter, I start off telling the personal story about how I came to develop the theory and the method and why and how I used it. The second chapter I'm working on now, and that is updating the theory and comparing it to theories that have been developed since Information Horizons came out in 1999.
Right.
Uh, then the third and fourth chapters, which I've written, the third chapter presents the methodology and how it's been used in conjunction with different methods and how it has been modified, particularly depending upon the study participants. So when the study participants are children, they've been given big sheets of paper and lots of colored markers and pencils to draw their information horizon with.
Right.
And in COVID, of course, people were doing this online, and I talk about that and some of the challenges, but solutions that people came up with respect to that, and how I give a very in-depth, step-by-step example of analyzing information horizon maps. A very detailed information horizon interview protocol is provided. And then I have a chapter that compares and contrasts it with other methods, some other information behavior methods. The fifth chapter is written by a colleague, Aurora. I have never met her. Jenna knows her, and it's through Jenna's connection that we approached Aurora Gonzalez, who does a content bibliometric analysis studies. And she's done these for Elfrida Chapman and Ryo Savalini. And she agreed to do one on information horizons theory and method to look at, how has it been used or not used in the literature. And, it's a bit, nerve-wracking because, she's doing the work independently. I'm not going to be influencing those results.
Right.
But she did an excellent job, and I was surprised with the results. I was pleasantly surprised by the results. So that's going to be in the book as well.
Yeah, so for somebody who may not be familiar with information horizon, how would you describe information horizon to any member of the audience in your own words?
Okay. So the information horizon theory posits, it looks at how individuals find information and share information. The idea is that, there are many different types of resources that we typically go to for information when we want information. I think Information Horizons was one of the first that talked about, social networks being information providers that help us find information. And experimentation in the world is also can be part of your information horizons, or where you go to find information, or places that provide you resources that provide you with information. So an information horizon is where you go for information, but also resources that can proactively provide you information. So you can think of, if you walk into a meeting and you don't know a lot of the people there in the room, a colleague may see your questioning face and proactively provide information and introduce you to people in the room.
Right.
So that's an example of an information resource proactively providing you information because they intuitively or by observation understand you don't know. You need to know some things that you don't know.
Right.
um, so your horizon, your information horizon, your experiences and knowledge of information resources, and including the practices around those information resources. Now, information horizons are not only influenced by our individual characteristics and needs, but also by the situation and context. And you yourself have written quite a lot about context.
Yeah.
So I'm starting that chapter, that portion of my theory chapter about that. But the original formulation, you had situations occurring within different contexts. So it could be the context of studying for a course, or could be the context of work, could be a context of, oh, I want to go to the movies
Right.
this week. Where do I go for information? And the theory also posits how we decide whether we're going to look for information or, ignore the fact that maybe we need this information or postpone it, right?
Right.
Then the method is a qualitative method that asks people to talk about when they've needed information and what they have done in those situations. The method is good for different contexts, to explore situations within different contexts. And I use the critical incident technique in the method. We're asking people to describe, talk about when it was dissatisfying to find information, or when it was difficult, when it was satisfying when they went to find information, when it was easy to find information. And after they've talked through a number of these situations, then I ask them would they draw an information horizon map, map it out, how they go about finding information in general. And this there's a couple of strengths to this approach. Is one, the study participants are doing the first level analysis for us when they create their map, because they are synthesizing everything that they've talked about in creating the map. And as an interviewer, if they've forgotten something, we can ask them, oh, well, why isn't such and such a resource included here? Or if they add a resource they didn't talk about before, we can say, well, why is that? And we can ask questions about, especially during the first component of if it was dissatisfying finding information or challenging, what was challenging about it? What about these resources didn't work well? And it also gives study participants a different way of sharing their experiences. A lot of people like drawing or mapping things out. It's a different approach to just talking or writing, and it adds a different component to them. They're in charge completely. They have the tools to do the drawing. The interviewer does not draw the map, does not provide a template. I know some other information visualization techniques, they'll provide a template to people to fill in. Now, in the Information Horizon interview is free form, however the user wants to, or user study participant wants to create that visualization of their information behavior, they can.
No, no,
And it turns out a lot of researchers are visual thinkers as well. And so they like that method.
no,
They like the
yeah, it is very interesting, and I think some of my own research has looked at the information sources and channels that people have used as well. And what I found was the kind of four or five areas in which ways in which people can gather information. One is from human sources, like people, friends, or colleagues, and all that. But then also whether you reach out to these people face to face, or you reach out to them through synchronous communication, like what we're doing right now on Zoom or through a telephone call, or through or instant chat, or an asynchronous communication like email or SMS, as like where you send something and you get something back later, as well as books and like any sorts of like books and media, or finally online information, which is like information where you're not communicating with someone, but it's something out there. So these were, I found that some of the sources that people tend to reach out to, but the insight that you brought was like people coming to you as well, looking at like trying to decipher your need, which is
yeah.
also very interesting.
Yeah.
And
And when I started this, people were not considered as information resources to the great extent that it was documents.
right.
Uh,
Yeah,
yeah.
and now a lot of it is Chat GPT and other kinds of AI tools and all that. So that's another interesting dimension that's
Yeah.
happening.
And that's why I have to revisit the theory and update it to talk about what does that mean in an information horizon. Um,
Right, when AI tools like
yeah, the lack of transparency there.
yes, and lack of transparency, also lack of reliability, where you cannot really trust a lot of the information which is out there, and you really have to verify.
Yes.
Yeah. So, who are some of the people who have influenced your work over the years?
Yeah. So I was thinking about that the other day, and Hermann Hesse wrote a book, Magister Ludi, or The Glass Bead Game, and that was influential in two ways in particular. One, that in the book, Magister Ludi learns that just staying in, what today we would call the ivory tower in academia doesn't change the world, doesn't impact anybody but those within academia. So real world research, is a concept that comes out of that book, interacting with the real world. And when you look at my research, that is a theme. throughout. People facing challenges, doing, research. And so my goal has always been, how can I assist those people? How can I work with them to make their tasks, their goals easier,
Right.
or right, even to achieve them in some cases where they couldn't be achieved before. So, with the work I did on 3D telepresence in emergency medicine, what could this technology help save lives? Big question,
Oh,
right?
yeah, yeah.
And the other takeaway, or one of the other takeaways from that book, was asking questions. Now, over the years, the saying "guide by the side" instead of teacher at what's the saying? Instead of being a teacher as a preacher, you're a guide by the side, and that certainly is in the book. And that's where I first thought about this and came to it. And when I would start teaching a course, I would talk about my philosophy in teaching. I would mention Hermann Hesse and the Glass-Steagall game and this notion of being the guide by the side, and that I would ask questions. And sure, for some classes at some levels, you have to provide a structure of information, but it was always then with questions, question driven, exercise driven, and questions about what happened during that exercise, etc. And that's, I run a collaboration workshop even today. Last year, PhD students in linguistics at a university in Sweden invited me to their 2-day workshop to come give my collaboration workshop. And I have a hands-on exercise that they did, and it worked out really well. They liked it, and they kept on talking for the rest of the workshop there. So being the guide by the side and trusting that it's going to go okay. When I first
Yeah, your
started,
first
it
one?
took me a while to understand, to get that self-confidence and trust that this will work.
Yes, and I think a teacher's role in some ways is just providing that environment or just being that facilitator, the guide, as you talk about, right? And this morning I was in a meeting with a group of students from Simmons who had attended an AI workshop, and and yesterday and today, and we were trying to see the ways in which they could suggest incorporating artificial intelligence in the courses that they've taken so far. And again, so I think it's taking the being the guide to now being to letting them lead in some ways and to see if they can help design the course or to help bring about components or what they call as value co-creation like so
Right, right. So when I teach theory development at the PhD level, which I've taught, many times in multiple countries, the students run part of those sessions that, I start off and, I do 1 or 2 sessions so that they can see what I'm talking about, and how you might approach this. And then they have to do. They have to run one of the class sessions. Well, depending how long the semester is, they usually end up doing 2 class sessions where they choose the readings and they are in charge of that class session, discussing those papers.
oh, that's wonderful. Yeah. And any incident that really influenced you?
Well, the instances that I talked about, with collaborating with the folks in chemistry, collaborating with the folks in computer science. It's hard to say because so many things have influenced me, and I've been fortunate enough to have lots of different experiences. And yeah,
Yes, and
I'm at a loss there.
no, I think you're right in the sense that it's a lot of smaller things which lead to other things, which lead to other things. So sometimes we might point out 1 or 2 things, but there might be other things which we haven't pointed out. But everything is, in a way, cause and effect, right? And things are influencing other things in profound ways sometimes. Yeah. And And you talked about some key skills. You talked about listening as a key skill, and you also talked about making connections between disparate things as a key skill. Anything you want to add to that list as a skill that has helped you over the years?
Planning is an important skill, I think. And when I moved into administration, being able to do strategic planning became very important, and developing a strategic plan. I and one of my successes there was when I went to UCD, they were just on the cusp of the government going bankrupt, and the government fully funded the universities at that time, and they kept on cutting back the university's budget, 20% one year, 20% the next year, 30% the next year. Monetary resources were quite tight, to say the least. And ours was a small school and not known broadly throughout the university. And so I read a paper in Jealous about, how LIS departments came to be discontinued at universities. What were some of the common things that had gone wrong? So I read that and took that to heart. And one of the things was not collaborating outside of the unit and not communicating with people outside of the unit, and not having persuasive strategic plans. So I put together a strategic plan, presented it to university management, and they actually increased our staffing as a result of my strategic plan in a time when no unit was getting additional faculty or administrative staff. We got both because I had the components of a strategic plan that they were looking for in there. And then the president decided, well, every unit should make a strategic plan. I didn't tell my colleagues that.
And I think it's also letting the data do the talking, right? In some ways, when you gather some data and you use that to make an argument, so it does provide more incentive for people to then provide you the funding.
Right. And to tell the story of the value your school, your unit brings to the table, and why it's important. Because that was actually the first part of the strategic plan, is why is information and library science important? Where do we fit in the scheme of things? And because they were men, I used a sports analogy for them. As I learned back at Belcourt when I used a parent analogy, and my boss said, great analogy, you're 100% correct, but none of the men in their 50s and 60s understood anything you were talking about. So I learned to know my audience, learn your audience, and figure out what analogy and story will work for your audience.
You've had this illustrious career, and I would not say had, I'd say that you are having, or you continue to have this illustrious career from academia to industry from industry to academia, and you're continuing to write even now, and conduct research. So, if you were to point out two or three things that you would rate as your biggest successes, what would those be?
So helping ASIS to become more international, including the name change from the American Society of Information Science and Technology to Association for Information Science and Technology. That was a big hurdle for a lot of people outside of North America joining and participating and contributing to ASIS. And also the membership fee structure, where I worked hard to get the board, and this was after I was president that it finally came to fruition where not everybody had to pay the North American fee. And I know it's gone through several iterations, and I always, bite my fingernails when I hear they're thinking about changing this again. So it's affordable for people. And, and again, I learned about the importance of this by listening to people. So listening to people in Croatia, in Poland, in Taiwan, in other parts of the world, in India, what that membership fee meant to them. How many months did they have to work for that membership fee?
Yeah.
So I think that was a success. I mean, ASIS has more international members today than ever before. Now, I don't know with the merger with SLA what the percentage of international members are, but certainly up to that point, there actually had a larger percentage of international members than members in the US and Canada.
Yes, and I think it has been a continuing theme, I think, to increase the international membership and to make it accessible. Like when I was president that time, one of the things that was to try to translate the About ACES page to multiple languages. And so I think the work that you did, and I remember when you were president, seeing that work happen at the time, right, is giving, I think, allowing people to see themselves in ASIST. I think that has been a key theme. And I think that theme continues to grow and evolve now as well, like, in different ways.
Yeah, yeah. And to be clear, I wasn't the one that started the international push. It had been a theme for a while, simmering. And I was fortunate enough that I was able to persuade the membership about the name change, and then later the board about the fee structure. And also, Mei Wu and I had worked years ago trying to get, the annual meeting outside of North America. And then that we finally were able to get the board to agree to that. And yourself and other presidents and other members have been working to increase the international perspective. Somebody made a donation that made it possible for a lot of people in Africa to get free membership. That was an anonymous donation, but how wonderful that happened.
No, I think it's really it's growing to such a large extent that later on, I think it became the one of the other imperatives became like, how do you now change this large membership that is sometimes not paying to become paying members, and for how long do you give free membership and stuff like that. So it's turning a whole cycle, but it's very interesting uh, to see these various push. And one of the things which I was thinking about once was like, how do you, like, I see ASIST as an organization of good people and smart people, people who are both good and smart. And now, how do you impart that value system to a fast growing membership that, along with smartness, how do you maintain the goodness? Or how do you bring about that goodness and not let that go away, which is an ASIST value,
Yeah.
right? So it's very interesting. So one theme that I wanted to ask you was about resilience. What phases of your life made you resilient, and what have been the hardest and most challenging times? And you can think of it in your personal life or your professional life that has required you to be a strongest and not break down under pressure.
Well, let me start by advertising a panel that I'm be on at this ASIS annual meeting. The title of the panel is Difficult Conversations. And there's 5 of us talking about challenges we have faced in academia. Sandra Erdeles is on the panel, Marcia Bates, Heidi Julian, June Abbas, and myself. And we've all have faced different challenges in academia. And we're going to be talking about those. So certainly as an assistant professor at UNC, there were real challenges being a woman interested in research within the school. So I can remember going to the research office and talking to people there, about what support do they provide writing research grants. After all, when I was at Belcour, I would review research grants that academics would send to Belcour. So I was a bit familiar with this. And I would make funding decisions about them, those submissions to Belcour in certain cases. And the director of the office said, he would never anyone from information and library science to submit to the NSF career program or to any program that only allowed one or two submissions from a university. He said, don't bother even writing it up. It's not going to go beyond, this office. He would never support that. And I said, why? He said, that you don't do research. In that school, you don't do research. And okay. So I said, okay, let me see what other program I can submit to. And certainly it was challenging when I found out that another assistant professor, a male, who had been hired and started the same time I did, who had a lower teaching load in terms of number of students. And, I taught all required courses. He taught no required courses, and he was earning a significant amount more than I did. And I had more publications and to my name than he did to his. So I went to the dean. I said, I just learned. Right. And she agreed that I had more experience, more credentials than this other person did, but my salary couldn't be equal to his because that would make him feel bad. It was okay for me to feel bad, but not for him to feel bad. So a bit challenging. And, for one of the research grants from the NIH, so at the university, there were different research offices for different types of research. So the NSF funding went through one research office. The NIH funding went through another research office. I had worked with my colleagues in computer science. We did the collaborative grant proposal. It was funded. We made one mistake in that in the budget for me, the school, only the abbreviation was given. SILS, not the full name was written out. Our mistake. We should have written out the full name on the budget form. So NIH calls up the University Research Office and says, what is this SILS? The research office said, you have no clue. Don't know what that is. We never heard of it. The NIH said, well, you better look into it and find out what it is, because we're not going to give you any of this $2 million if this isn't a legitimate unit at your university. So I get a call saying, who are you? Where are you? What are you doing? Why are you on this grant? And I explained all of this. The solution was I had to go around and get the dean of my school, the vice provost, the dean of the arts and sciences, and the department head of computer science, each to sign an individual letter verifying that SILS was a legitimate school academic unit at that university. And I had 24 hours to do that. I was given that deadline.
That's crazy. Yeah.
My fingers crossed. Luckily, everybody was in and they signed it. And this was not the first time I had to go around and get additional signatures. When the first grant proposal I ever submitted got the approval sheet signed by everybody who I needed to have it signed in order to submit it. And then the Office of Sponsored Research went through the budget, and 11 o'clock the night before the day, I had to mail it out. They gave me everything back, but on the sheet of paper with the approvals, they said, you need to get the vice provost to sign off on this. There's no place on the form for the vice provost to sign off on it. So 8 o'clock in the morning, I'm at the vice provost's office. But the vice provost was away. So I sat with the secretary, and as each assistant provost came in, assistant vice provost, she would go and ask them to please sign this form. And they were all saying, there's no place in this form for me to sign. Why am I being asked to sign this form? I'm not putting my name on this form. Thank goodness one woman took pity on me, came out, and she said, why do I need to sign this form? And I said, I have no idea. Here's the note from the Office of Sponsored Research saying I need to get somebody's signature from this office on this form. I said, I have no clue. I've called them. I've left them emails asking why and where to sign. Well, the woman was very nice, and she eventually signed it, and she signed it for me so I could send it out. Well, it turns out the Office of Sponsored Research wanted somebody in the provost's office, wanted the vice provost actually to sign it, because he had never heard of our school doing a grant proposal, and he didn't know the dean of the school.
So I think in many ways you have paved the path for other people to be able to do it more easily later on,
Yes,
apply for grants and stuff. Yeah.
yes, especially on that. But in general, I mean, at UCD, I ran into the same thing when the deputy president, a new deputy president was appointed. I invited the deputy president to meet. I said, can I meet with you and introduce our school to you? And he said, I'll give you 30 minutes. I said, great, name the date, time, and place, and I'll be there. Well, he came to my office because I think he wanted to be able to leave.
Right.
And we started talking. And, we came up to 25 minutes. He was still very comfortable in his seat talking with me. He spent an hour and a half. He ended up spending an hour and a half talking with me, learning about the school, the field. And he said, before you called, I didn't even know we had an information and library science school on campus, at our university. I'd never heard of it before. So, it has happened more than once.
Right. And
also doing interdisciplinary research. I would say, I wasn't the first person to do it, but I certainly, at the university, when I was an assistant professor, in that school I was. And in general, in our field did not do much interdisciplinary research back in the 90s. It has become more accepted now. But here's another interesting story, that the first time I was presenting the research on the nanomanipulator project to a program officer, it turned out there was a new NSF program officer assigned to our project. And he came down to the university and wanted to meet everybody and hear about the different work that was going on. Well, that included me. I was a co-principal investigator on this project. It came my turn to present. I had 15 minutes time slot, or was it 20? Don't remember. I was introduced. I had my first slide there. And before I could say a word, the program officer shouted, "What the hell is somebody from library science doing on this project?" He was very angry. And he did use that phrasing. And here I am. I immediately went, oh, well, thank goodness one of my colleagues, talked for a few seconds there, explaining, well, it's a very respected school, Diane, blah, blah, blah. And I started and I said, give me 5 minutes. If after 5 minutes you don't see why I'm working on this project, you and I let's have a conversation about this, but give me 5 minutes. So I started my presentation and I'm checking my watch, 5 minutes came past. He's still sitting there. He hasn't said a word.
Right.
8 minutes passed. I gave my whole presentation. He didn't interrupt it. He said, good work. It turns out he had gone to colleagues in information and library science when he was starting the Genome Project. And because he saw this as a classification project. And who better to help with it? Library and information science experts.
Right.
Every expert he went to in our field turned him down and said it didn't have to do with the physical library. They weren't interested in it. And he was angry about that ever since. This was, decades later, and he was still angry in our field. But to his credit, he listened, and our project became his favorite project. At that point, NIH was still running multiple projects to do the same thing, investigate the same types of questions. And he was in our corner the whole time. And he had a conference workshop where he brought all the projects together and we had to present. And he was very negative for all of these, for the other projects and ours. He didn't ask a question during the presentations. He said, good work. And he said later privately, he said, you guys have done the best job of the 5 projects.
What is something you wish you knew earlier in your life?
I wish I knew that it's okay to rest, to regroup, to take care of yourself.
That's wonderful. Yes. And what are your life principles or values that you follow? What are your life lessons?
My life lessons. One thing that I always ask myself before starting a project is it the right thing to do? And I think that's something that individuals follow, but we don't necessarily talk about in our field, that we should we should always think about this. Is it the right thing to do? And why would it be the right thing? I know we talk about impact now more than in the past, but this is related but different. Do you feel it's the right thing to do? What are your moral values that you bring to where you would select this project or not, or do this or not, teach a course a particular way or not? And the other thing, it's an old saying, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And, keep that in mind. Yes, I've made mistakes and I probably should have done some things differently, but I always did it with trying to do unto others, trying to follow these rules and these lessons. And, so for example, in the US academic system, going from assistant to associate professor with tenure is a big deal.
Right.
If you don't get tenure, you have a year to find another job. Well, I wanted to go up for tenure early because I had spent 2 years as a postdoc. I had a strong record. I was asked not to do that because a colleague had to go up that year. And if my portfolio went in alongside hers, she would not be given tenure. She would not get the promotion and tenure. And so I was asked to wait, and I did. Now, this meant, not only was the raise delayed, because in the intervening year, the university had a budget crisis and no salary raises were given out. So now I didn't just postpone that salary increase. It didn't happen as a result, but it was the right thing to do. That person deserved that promotion and tenure, even though on paper we had different. It was different. It told a different story. But I had faced hurdles, but she had faced different hurdles and many hurdles herself. And yeah,
Yeah, so I think it's one of those difficult decisions and the turning points where we have to make difficult choices at different points. Yeah,
yeah,
and the earlier part where you talked about choosing a research project carefully or asking whether it's the right thing. A lot of people I feel pick things based on what is publishable or what is in demand kind of a thing versus
yeah,
versus what is the right thing to do. And I think sometimes people look at it in terms of effort, like, oh, this has quantitative research, and or does this have qualitative data gathering, or what am I more familiar with, kind of a way of approach to things, rather than whether this is the right method for it or the right thing to do.
right. And so an example of that was the project where I tried out the Information Horizon interview method for the first time. And so the project was working with historically Black and minority colleges to set up e-mentoring with industrial scientists for biology students at those universities. This had been a problem where, you know, the scientists would come for a visit on campus. They would be there for like a day and a half at most, and really didn't have time to interact or get to know the students and really share a lot with the students. They would come in, protocol would say they would have to meet with the university president, the provost, the department chair, and then give a formal presentation, and then maybe have an hour with the students, and then they had to, meanwhile they were answering emails and phone calls from back at their workplace. Not a lot of interaction took place. So colleagues and I, both at UNC, at the university, and at historically minority colleges, thought it would be a good idea to try an e-mentoring system where there could be more interaction between the corporate scientists and students. We got funding from the Howard Hughes Medical Institute and J&J to do that, and GlaxoSmithKline. Well, so the project would bring resources. We could hire students to help code and run the program, but I knew my colleagues wouldn't view this as legitimate research. What did it have to do with libraries? What did it to do with information science? Who really cares about, the historically Black universities and colleges? In the same way, they care about if you're collaborating with somebody from MIT, or, is not prestigious in the same way. So I thought, well, I need to bring something into this project that my colleagues can understand and see some value in. And that's when I folded in the Information Horizon method into that project to balance things out and to let my colleagues see that we can do information science, information behavior research in these other contexts.
Yeah. So what does happiness mean to you?
Oh, I have no idea. It's a very hard question. To me, happiness, I always laugh at these surveys about which country have the happiest people.
All
And,
right.
Denmark is usually up there. I know many people are miserable in Denmark. I would not call them happy, or do they call themselves happy? So it means a lot of different things, and they're small things. It's not one type of thing or one big thing, but it's small pleasures that one gets to experience and recognize. Yeah.
So small pleasures, you want to give one or two examples of that?
I'm sorry.
Do you want to give one or two examples of the small pleasures that mean happiness to you?
Going on vacation with children, my
Okay.
adult children. Yeah, that's an example.
Okay.
Even if it's just for a long weekend or a week. Um,
Right.
yeah.
Okay. And my next question is like, what are your goals now? I know you talked about the book that you're doing, and are there any other goals apart from that book?
I want to increase my retirement time, my time allocated to retirement activities.
Okay.
That's my goal. That's one of my goals. So I have the book, big project. I review research projects and centers for the European Commission. I review academic programs for accreditation, SILUP, the Charter Institutes of Library and Information Professionals. And, I've been reducing those review projects, the review work that I do, especially for the European Commission. And I want to continue moving in that direction.
You want to have slightly more time for yourself and what retirement might mean.
Yeah.
So, what mentoring advice would you have for people who might follow in your footsteps?
Ask to seek out what needs to be investigated or improved. Listen when you're asking and when people are talking. Ask thoughtful questions. And this is not just when you're doing qualitative research interviews. This is in general, when talking with colleagues, when trying to come up with a research topic, listening to people, observing what is happening around you, or going to places and observing to begin to understand, what are the challenges people face,
Right.
and then think about what can your role be in addressing those challenges. Another piece of advice is to help colleagues who need help. I've never regretted helping a colleague, never. And it's a good thing to do. And another piece of advice is learn from a variety of people. Learn from stellar and not so stellar managers and leaders. Some of the best teachers I have been people who would say that was not a great manager. But I took that as to what not to do, what to avoid going forward. And I think that was useful to learn. As painful as it is at times to be in those situations, it can be useful. You can use it later. So that would be my advice. And of course, the other thing is, forge new directions. And it's going to be, that's what I did. And I can't tell people what new directions to forge. That's something everybody needs to discover themselves. And I can suggest ways of figuring that out, the listening, the thoughtful questions, seeing new connections between disparate things. But everybody has to figure that out themselves. And we see that in the different, as our field progresses, I think we're seeing people forge different paths and do different things, investigate different types of research questions, and looking at the impact of the potential impact there. We've talked quite a bit. I've told quite a few stories.
Thank you, Dan. I'm glad we spoke, and this is certainly very, very important to me, and I'm glad we were able to speak today. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you for inviting me.